Missing in action is a casualty classification assigned to armed services personnel and other combatants who are reported missing during wartime. They may have been killed, wounded, become a prisoner of war, or deserted. If deceased, neither their remains nor grave has been positively identified. Becoming MIA has been an occupational risk for as long as there has been warfare. Problems and solutions. Until around 1912, service personnel in most countries were not routinely issued with ID tags. As a result, if someone was killed in action and his body was not recovered until much later, there was little or no chance of identifying the remains. Starting around the time of the First World War, nations began to issue their service personnel with purpose-made ID tags. Usually, these were made of some form of lightweight metal such as aluminum. However, in the case of the British Army, the material chosen was compressed fibre, which was not very durable. Although wearing ID tags proved to be highly beneficial, the problem remained that bodies could be completely destroyed, burned or buried by the type of high-explosive munitions routinely used in modern warfare. Additionally, the combat environment itself could increase the likelihood of missing personnel such as jungle warfare, or submarine warfare, and air crashes in remote mountainous terrain, a desert, or at sea. Alternatively, there could be administrative errors, e.g., the actual location of a temporary battlefield grave could be misidentified or forgotten due to the fog of war. Finally, since military forces had no strong incentive to keep detailed records of enemy dead bodies were frequently buried in temporary graves, the locations of which were often lost or obliterated, e.g., the forgotten mass grave at Fromelles. As a result, the remains of missing combatants might not be found for many years, if ever. When missing combatants are recovered and cannot be identified after a thorough forensic examination, the remains are interred with a tombstone which indicates their unknown status. The development of genetic fingerprinting in the late 20th century means that if cell samples from a cheek swab are collected from service personnel prior to deployment to a combat zone, identity can be established using even a small fragment of human remains. Although it is possible to take genetic samples from a close relative of the missing person, it is preferable to collect such samples directly from the subjects themselves. It is a fact of warfare that some combatants are likely to go missing in action and never be found. However, by wearing ID tags and using modern technology, the numbers involved can be considerably reduced. In addition to the obvious military advantages, conclusively identifying the remains of missing service personnel is highly beneficial to the surviving relatives. Having positive identification makes it somewhat easier to come to terms with their loss and move on with their lives. Otherwise, some relatives may suspect that the missing person is still alive somewhere and may return someday. However, many of these identifying procedures are not typically used for combatants who are members of militias, mercenary armies, insurrections, and other irregular forces. Before the 20th century, it is possible that some of the soldiers who fought at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC went missing in action. Certainly, the numerous wars which followed over successive centuries created many MIAs. The list is long and includes most battles which have ever been fought by any nation. The usual problems of identification caused by rapid decomposition were exacerbated by the fact that it was common practice to loot the remains of the dead for any valuables, e.g., personal items and clothing. This made the already difficult task of identification even harder. Thereafter, the dead were routinely buried in mass graves and scant official records were retained. Notable examples include such medieval battles as Teuton, the 100 Years' War, the later English Civil Wars and Napoleonic Wars, together with any battle taking place until around the middle of the 19th century. Starting around the time of the Crimean War, American Civil War and Franco-Prussian War, it became more common to make formal efforts to identify individual soldiers. However, since there was no formal system of ID tags at the time, this could be difficult during the process of battlefield clearance. Even so, there had been a notable shift in perceptions, e.g., where the remains of a soldier in Confederate uniform were recovered from, say, the Gettysburg battlefield. He would be interred in a single grave with a headstone which stated that he was an unknown Confederate soldier. This change in attitudes coincided with the Geneva Conventions, the first of which was signed in 1864. Although the First Geneva Convention did not specifically address the issue of MEIS, the reasoning behind it was influential. World War I. The phenomenon of MEIS became particularly notable during World War I, where the mechanized nature of modern warfare meant that a single battle could cause astounding numbers of casualties. For example, in 1916 over 300,000 Allied and German service personnel were killed in the Battle of the Somme. A total of 19,240 British and Commonwealth troops were killed in action or died of wounds on the first day of that battle alone. It is therefore not surprising that the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing of the Somme in France bears the names of 72,090 British and Commonwealth soldiers, all of whom went missing in action during the Battle of the Somme, were never found and who have no known grave. Similarly, the Menengate Memorial in Belgium commemorates 54,896 missing Allied soldiers who are known to have been killed in the Ypres salient. The Douaumont-Ossuary, meanwhile, contains 130,000 unidentifiable sets of French and German remains from the Battle of Verdun. Even in the 21st century, the remains of missing soldiers are recovered from the former battlefields of the Western Front every year. These discoveries happen regularly, often during the course of agricultural work or construction projects. Typically, the remains of one or several men are found at a time. However, occasionally the numbers recovered are much larger, e.g., the mass grave at Fromelles, which contained the skeletal remains of no less than 250 Allied soldiers. Another example is the excavation which took place at Karsbach in early 2012, which uncovered the remains of 21 German soldiers lost in an underground shelter since 1918, after being buried by a large-caliber British artillery shell. Regardless, efforts are made to identify any remains found via a thorough forensic examination. If this is achieved, attempts are made to trace any living relatives. However, it is frequently impossible to identify the remains, other than to establish some basic details of the unit they served with. In the case of British and Commonwealth MEIS, the headstone is inscribed with the maximum amount of information that is known about the person. Typically, such information is deduced from metallic objects such as brass buttons and shoulder flashes bearing regimental unit insignia found on the body. As a result, headstones are inscribed with such information as a soldier of the Cameronians, or an Australian corporal, etc. Where nothing is known other than that the person fought on the Allied side, the headstone is inscribed, a soldier of the Great War. The term sailor or airman can be substituted, as appropriate. World War II. There are many missing combatants from World War II. In the United States Armed Forces, 78,750 personnel missing in action had been reported by the end of the war, representing over 19% of the total of 405,399 killed during the conflict. As with MEIS from the First World War, it is a routine occurrence for the remains of missing combatants killed during the Second World War to be periodically discovered. Usually they are found purely by chance, though on some occasions they are recovered following deliberate, targeted searches. As with the First World War, in Western Europe MEIS are generally found as individuals, or in twos or threes. However, sometimes the numbers in a group are considerably larger, e.g., the mass grave at Villeneuve-Loubet, which contained the remains of 14 German soldiers killed in August 1944. Others are located at remote aircraft crash sites in various countries. Almost 500,000 German Mies have been buried in new graves since the end of the Cold War. Most of them will stay unknown. The German War Graves Commission is spearheading the effort. Similarly, there are approximately 4 million missing Russian service personnel scattered across the former Eastern Front, from Leningrad down to Stalingrad. Though around 300 volunteer groups make periodic searches of old battlefields to recover human remains for identification and reburial. During the 2000s, there was renewed attention within and without the U.S. military to finding remains of the missing, especially in the European theater, and especially since aging witnesses and local historians were dying off. The group World War II Families for the Return of the Missing was founded in 2005 to work with the Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command and other governmental entities towards locating and repatriating the remains of Americans lost in the conflict. The president of the group said in reference to the far more publicized efforts to find remains of U.S. dead from the Vietnam War, Vietnam had advocates. This was an older generation, and they didn't know who to turn to. In 2008, investigators began to conduct searches on Tarawa Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, trying to locate the remains of 139 American Marines, missing since the Battle of Tarawa in 1943. According to the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Accounting Office, there were still 73,515 U.S. servicemen still unaccounted for from World War II. Korean War. There are many missing combatants from the Korean War. It is thought that 13,000 South Korean soldiers and 2,000 U.S. soldiers are buried in the Korean Demilitarized Zone alone. The U.S. Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command and the equivalent South Korean command are actively involved in trying to locate and identify remains of both countries' personnel. Remains of missing combatants from the Korean War are periodically recovered and identified in both North and South Korea. As of December 2015, the estimated number of U.S. personnel unaccounted for from the war is 7,833. A U.S. Department of Defense loss concentrations map estimates nearly 50% of U.S. POWs are still lost in North Korea. 1,200-1,273 in POW camps, 1,109-1,559 in Unsan, Chongchon area, 89 in the DMZ, UN cemeteries, Kotori, Hungnam, Wonsam, Pyongyang, total 266, Chosun, Reservoir 523-1002, which total 3,260 to 4,116 DPAA. Listing of Korean War Mias. By October 1950, an estimated 700 U.S. POWs had been captured by the North Koreans. By August 1953, only 262 were still alive. One of the survivors was PFC Wayne Johnny Johnson, who secretly documented 496 military and civilian POWs who had died during internment. In 1996, Johnson was awarded the Silver Star Medal for Valor. In August 1953, General James Van Fleet, who had led U.S. and UN forces in Korea, estimated that a large percentage of those service members listed as missing in action were alive. The 1991–1993 United States Senate Select Committee on POW-MIA Affairs investigated some outstanding issues and reports related to the fate of U.S. service personnel still missing from the Korean War. In 1996, the Defense Department stated that there was no clear evidence any of the U.S. prisoners were still alive. As of 2005, at least 500 South Korean prisoners of war were believed to be still detained by the North Korean regime. In 2005, the U.S. suspended talks with North Korea over the recovery of Mias. In 2010, it was reported that the Obama administration was reversing the Bush administration's suspended talks in regard to North Korea Mias. In 2011, the Veterans of Foreign Wars adopted Resolution No. 423 calling for renewed discussions with North Korea to recover Americans missing in action. In January 2012, it was announced that members of JPAC would go to North Korea in the spring to search for an estimated 5,000 MIAs in the Unsan and the chosen reservoir areas. In February 2012, talks were going ahead between the U.S. and North Korea to resume discussions to recover U.S. MIAs after 7 years. In March 8, 2012, the U.S. announced it would search for MIAs in North Korea. However, on March 21, 2012, U.S. President Obama's administration suspended talks with North Korea over the recovery of U.S. servicemen killed and missing in North Korea. In October 2014, North Korea announced it was going to move the remains of about 5,000 U.S. servicemen en masse in an apparent attempt to force the U.S. to restart MIA recovery. As of December 2015, the DPAA does not currently conduct operations in North Korea. Australians MIA in Korea. A number of Australian military personnel have also never been recovered from Korea. North Korean unknowns since 1996. The remains of Korean People's Army soldiers recovered from battlefield exhumations across South Korea have been buried in the cemetery for North Korean and Chinese soldiers. The majority of the over 770 burials are unknowns. Vietnam War. Following the Paris Peace Accords of 1973, 591 U.S. prisoners of war were returned during Operation Homecoming. The U.S. listed about 1,350 Americans as prisoners of war or missing in action, and roughly 1,200 Americans reported killed in action and body not recovered. By the early 1990s, this had been reduced to a total of 2,255 unaccounted for from the war, which constituted less than 4% of the total 58,152 U.S. service members killed. This was by far the smallest proportion in the nation's history to that point. About 80% of those missing were airmen who were shot down over North Vietnam or Laos, usually over remote mountains, tropical rainforest, or water. The rest typically disappeared in confused fighting in dense jungles. Investigations of these incidents have involved determining whether the men involved survived their shootdown, and if not, efforts to recover their remains. POW/MIA activists played a role in pushing the U.S. government to improve its efforts in resolving the fates of the missing. Progress in doing so was slow until the mid-1980s, when relations between the U.S. and Vietnam began to improve and more cooperative efforts were undertaken. Normalization of U.S. relations with Vietnam in the mid-1990s was a culmination of this process. Considerable speculation and investigation has gone to a theory that a significant number of these men were captured as prisoners of war by communist forces in the two countries and kept as live prisoners after the war's conclusion for the United States in 1973. A vocal group of POW/MIA activists maintained that there has been a concerted conspiracy by the Vietnamese government and every American government since then to hide the existence of these prisoners. The U.S. government has steadfastly denied that prisoners were left behind or that any effort has been made to cover up their existence. Popular culture has reflected the live prisoners theory, most notably in the 1985 film Rambo: First Blood Part 2. Several congressional investigations have looked into the issue, culminating with the largest and most thorough. The United States Senate Select Committee on POW/MIA Affairs of 1991 to 1993, led by Senators John Kerry, Bob Smith, and John McCain. Its unanimous conclusion found no compelling evidence that proves that any American remains alive in captivity in Southeast Asia. This missing in action issue has been a highly emotional one to those involved, and is often considered the last depressing divisive aftereffect of the Vietnam War. To skeptics, live prisoners is a conspiracy theory unsupported by motivation or evidence, and the foundation for a cottage industry of charlatans who have preyed upon the hopes of the families of the missing. As two skeptics wrote in 1995, the conspiracy myth surrounding the Americans who remained missing after Operation Homecoming in 1973 had evolved to baroque intricacy. By 1992, there were thousands of zealots who believed with cult-like fervor that hundreds of American POWs had been deliberately and callously abandoned in Indochina after the war, that there was a vast conspiracy within the armed forces and the executive branch, spanning 5 administrations, to cover up all evidence of this betrayal, and that the governments of Communist Vietnam and Laos continued to hold an unspecified number of living American POWs. Despite their adamant denials of this charge, believers reject such notions. As one wrote in 1994, it is not conspiracy theory, not paranoid myth, not Rambo fantasy. It is only hard evidence of a national disgrace. American prisoners were left behind at the end of the Vietnam War. They were abandoned because 6 presidents and official Washington could not admit their guilty secret. They were forgotten because the press and most Americans turned away from all things that reminded them of Vietnam. There are also a large number of North Vietnamese and Viet Congmists from the Vietnam War whose remains have yet to be recovered. In 1974, General Vo Nguyen Giap stated that they had 330,000 missing in action. As of 1999, estimates of those missing were usually around 300,000. The Vietnamese government did not have any organized program to search for its own missing, in comparison to what it had established to search for American missing. The discrepancy angered some Vietnamese. As one said, "It's crazy for the Americans to keep asking us to find their men. We lost several times more than the Americans did. In any war there are many people who disappear. They just disappear." In the 2000s, thousands of Vietnamese were hiring psychics in an effort to find the remains of missing family members. The Vietnamese army organizes what it considers to be the best of the psychics, as part of its parapsychology force trying to find remains. Additionally, remains dating from the earlier French colonial era are sometimes discovered. In January 2009, the remains of at least 50 anti-French resistance fighters dating from circa 1946 to 1947 were discovered in graves located under a former market in central Hanoi. According to the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, as of 2015 there are still 1,627 U.S. servicemen still unaccounted for from the Vietnam War.